I'm Julie Herman of Jaybird Quilts and Lazy Girl Designs, and welcome back to the Gravity Sew Along. Now that we have done all of our cutting for month 8, it's time to begin piecing our blocks. If you didn't see the cutting video, I suggest you start there. The link can be found in the caption below. This month's block includes a partial seam, which we did previously in month 6, and as you now know, it's not as scary as it looks. The first step, though, is we need to create this unit, which has 2 triangles on either side of our pieced half hexagon. So it's very easy to get things mixed up this month, so I highly suggest you use your tags. So I'm going to be using my F triangles to sew onto either side of my combo of E and D, my half hexagon that I made from those. And when doing this, I like to actually sew with the blunt points of my triangles lined up with the blunt points of my half hexagon. So that's what that looks like. You can see a diagram on page 28 as well. So let me show you what it looks like when we go to piece it. And I'm going to line up that one with this one. And then my sharp point will overhang, and I'm going to sew to that valley. If you prefer, you know that you can go ahead and blunt more corners of your triangles to help have additional alignment points. Again, always starting with my leader ender so I don't get that little nest of threads underneath my plate here. And just nice and slow. This is also a good opportunity to use a stiletto. Things do get tiny as we get close to the machine. I'm just going to repeat that with all 3. I don't need to worry about pressing yet because my next piece is not going to intersect that, but that's what we look like so far. And then for the next one, it's going to be over here. And I prefer sewing with the triangle on top. So I'm actually going to be starting from the valley where the point comes off, sewing to this. But if that confuses you, you can always line it up and then flip and sew with the triangle underneath. Either way works. I'll show you both. So like I said, I prefer to sew this way. There's no one right or wrong way. Both will get you to the same place. So there's that. And then if you want to sew from the blunt corner, you would line up your triangle, flip it towards the machine. You can pin if you'd like, make sure nothing is moved, and then go ahead and sew the length of the seam. Once you have gone ahead and sewn all of those, head on over to the iron to press those seams open, and you will have this triangle, which is at this point half of our block. If you look on page 29, we're going to be making 2 large triangles and then putting those 2 large triangles together to complete our block. So this is one of them, and this one is our ABC with our D center. So now that I know that, and I know that I have the correct center, I can take my tag off. And the first step for this one is to take my triangle and begin to piece it to this, but I only want to sew half of this seam, and that is because, as I mentioned, it's a partial seam, and we need to leave that open for our last piece. So I am going to flip it onto here, and this, let me show you, right there will line up perfectly. And in this situation, I actually am going to use a pin, and I'll show you why. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a pin in the middle, and then I'm actually going to put a second pin a little bit right past it, and that one's going to go into my space here. And that's because I'm going to sew from this side, since I only want to sew this first half. And that pin is my red flag to remind myself, hey, Julie, stop. Don't keep going. So I like to have that visual cue. If you don't want to sew from this side, you also could use that as your visual cue of this is where I want to start, and I want to start here and sew the rest of the seam. So either put it underneath here, sew this, or do as I'm about to do, which is I'm going to sew from here and I'm going to stop before I get to my pins. Make sure this is not in the way. Make sure you can see everything. So I'm just going to stop, take my project, cut my threads. I'm going to find my little scrap. Make sure to sew right back onto that. I don't like getting that little nest of threads. So now I'm going to go ahead and pull those pins out. And this is what that looks like. That's what I want. I want it to kind of be hanging there as a partial seam so that when I get to the last piece, I'll be able to add it. So all that I need to do right now is flip it over and do a little bit of a finger press right here, just so I can get that flat enough to add the next piece. So right now we just completed step 1 on page 29 and we're moving on to step 2. So this is step 2. We're going to take our next one and we're going to sew it on there. And I like to do this by taking my big centerpiece and flipping it over. Now, neither one of these triangles are blunt, so there really is no specific alignment points. If you would like to go ahead and blunt those so that you know better where to align, that is a good option, or you can just eyeball it and pin it in place. So I'm going to go ahead and blunt these corners so that I have some alignment points. And I'm going to use my mini hexagon since I'm over at my machine. I don't have a lot of space, but the same can be done with the regular hexagon, the sidekick, or the super sidekick. Just line up the two edges with the blunt point here and trim off that tiny little triangle. And this does take more time, but I have found that it can really help with accuracy. And it's the kind of thing that if you find you don't need it, that's totally fine. If you find you're struggling with accuracy, with lining things up, then give this a try and take a moment to do this and see if it helps you be more successful. So now that we have those cut, we know that this is going to line up here. And as you know, I'm not a frequent pinner, but this is the point where I do get to pinning because there's a lot of different things going on here. So I find it does help at this point. And then this one goes here. And then I don't sew from this side. I prefer to sew from this side because I have a point and I want to make sure that I don't lose that point. You can see it's kind of bowing out right now and I'll be able to just push it back in there. But if I'm sewing from this side, I can make sure that my needle lands right in there so that I don't lose that point. If I'm sewing from the other side, I don't have that visual cue. After I get a couple stitches, I'm going to take that pin out because you never want to sew over pins. Get everything lined up. Just slowly sew till I get to my center, and then I'm going to go real slow through the center. Make sure that I land right at that point, and then continue. And where we sewed the first seam partial, we are sewing this one complete, and then we'll be doing the next one complete, and then I'll show you how we finish that partial seam. So there we go. As you can see, that turned out great. And now I don't need to worry about pressing the full length of this seam at this point. I just need to go ahead and press just right here so that I'll be able to sew this piece to my next one. And I'm going to go ahead and actually, I'm not going to trim my corners just so you can see what it looks like. I think I would actually prefer to trim them because I like what happens when I do feel more accurate, but I want to show you what it looks like if you don't so you can see the options. So this piece is kind of getting a little bit in the way right now, and if you find it's too much in the way, feel free to fully fold it back and just take a pin to pin it out of your way for now. So you just need access to this piece. We are on step 4, and you can see there's kind of a lot going on at this point. So we're taking this to here, and as I mentioned, I'm not going to blunt my points this time, just so you can see. I still think I'm going to sew it pretty accurately, but I do prefer that double check. I'm going to put 2 pins in. And ideally, if everything is cut and lined up right, I should be sewing from that valley to this valley. And again, I'm going to be slow when I get to this point so that I can sew right into there. turned out pretty good. And so now we're going to go ahead and unpin the piece that we had flipped back. And we need to go ahead and finger press this seam before we can sew the length of our final seam. Let me show you what that's going to look like. So we're going to finger press this open. And you can iron these as you go. I just like staying at the machine. So now what we're going to do is we're going to pick this up along where it needs to be. And it's going to feel weird over here because the seam doesn't go the full length. But we're going to pick it up and put these right sides together. And again, you can blunt that point if you would like. And I do suggest pinning. Actually, I want to be on the other side. I might move that pin. So what I want to be doing is getting this nice and lined up, because what I'm going to do is take it from the sewing machine, sew from here. And then when I get to where I am, I'm going to sew about a 1/2 inch past. I don't need to sew much. I don't need a back stitch, and I don't need to go more than that. Just about a 1/2 inch will do enough to lock it in place. And then our triangle will be complete, which is half of our block. Nice and slow, and pulling out my pins as I go. And I'm going to do my best to have my needle head right towards there so that things line up. And so it's about 5 stitches, give or take. All right. Let's see how that turned out. Beautiful. It'll look especially good when it's pressed. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my iron on, press this, finish sewing the two, and I'll be back in a moment to show you sewing those two halves together. As I mentioned, I went ahead and pressed everything and finished sewing my two halves. So now I need to sew them together to complete my diamond block. And in this block, we don't have any places to do hang pin, but we do have places to pin. So I'm going to show you how I decide where and how I'm going to pin. And so there's going to be 3 places, 1, 2, 3. And this one looks like hang pin on this side, but there's no specific place on this side to put it in. This one is just a cross, and then this one is like this. So I'm going to start with the middle one, and I'm going to line up those dog ears on top of each other that are in the seam allowance, those little triangles, because that is my alignment. Sometimes those are helpful to have. So I'm going to go ahead, place my first pin. And then over here, I am going to line up this point from sewing this seam with the bottom corner of this dog ear. So that's what that's going to look like. Grab another pin. And then my 2 sharp points should perfectly line up on top of each other, so no need to cut either one of them blunt because they're both sharp. Then over here, we're going to do the same thing we did here, which is, actually we have a dog ear. That must be one of the times I didn't trim it. But if you didn't, you would line up that seam with the corner of that dog ear. But since I have it, I'm going to go ahead and line it up. Put a pin, and then pin the corner. And then you could just go ahead and sew the length of it. Cross your fingers, hope for the best, but by now you should know that's rarely how I do it. There's always a little trick here. So I am mostly concerned with this point and then this point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little bit of thread pinning and sew here, and then I'm going to flip and sew here from this side, and then I'll show you what that looks like. And then if I'm happy with both, I will go ahead and then sew the length of the entire seam. So I'm simply going to make sure my pin is out of my seam allowance. It is. And I'm going to go about 1/2 inch before and after that point. And I want to make sure that my needle goes down exactly at that point. Because the reality is right now this might be a little over or a little under 1/4 inch. Not everything is perfect, and that's okay. This is kind of a way to accommodate for that. So do that there. Since I'm on my project, I don't actually need my scrap. So I'm going to do the same thing about a 1/2 inch before And it looks like here is one of those examples of where I'm a little bit scant. And I might not have known that if I was on the other side, but from this side I can see that, so I can accommodate that and get that point where it is. Okay, so now what I'm going to do carefully, because I can take this pin out, still do have 3 pins. I'm going to carefully open this up and just look. Oh, look how beautiful that is. And let's check the other one. Not perfect, but pretty darn close. It could be a tiny bit tighter there, but it's good enough for me. So now what I'm going to do is now I'm going to sew the length of the piece. But because I have those threads already there, I don't need to worry about the fact that I can't see this point from this side, because I'm just going to sew directly on top of the thread that I already sewed. And I'm going to leave that thread pinning there. No need to take it out. So nice and slow, pull my pins out as I go. And you'll see sometimes there's a little bit of the bottom piece poking out. Things like that happen at this point, and we do our best to accommodate them. So nice and slow, right on top of my previous stitching. And nice and slow to this point. I could have done the thread pinning on this one too to check the alignment. Guess I'm rolling the dice here on that one. I think it'll be okay. This does take a little more time, but as I've said, with many things, I find a little bit more extra time here results in a lot less extra time of me taking out stitches because I'm unhappy with how things ended up lining up. So I'd rather take the time on this end because I really don't like taking stitches out. I don't really know anybody who does. Oh, I got lucky. My center lined it up perfectly. So now, there we go. I'm going to go ahead and head on over to the iron and press the seam open, and then go ahead and piece my blue block to complete my other Eclipse block. Thanks for watching. If this video was helpful for you, be sure to like it, leave a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. Show us your progress on your gravity blocks in our Facebook group. We'd love to see how you're coming along with your quilt. The link to the Facebook group is below. I'll be back here in the next video to show you how to do cutting for block 9.